Okay, so I believe people will be straggling in as we move forward. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the, I guess now the second thesis and dissertation workshop. This is a follow-up to a very well-received event that we did last fall. But today's workshop is obviously being held online. And we're also recording this to accommodate our many students who are either off campus or part-time, or even those who are here on campus but just want to be
انا
able to
بكره
refer
البريدنج
to.
عشان احنا زي.
If I could please ask everyone to please mute their microphones so we don't have too many interruptions as we go forward, and or the interruptions that we do get, they'll be the questions that we're asking our speaker. Thanks. So anyway, my name is Jeff Lacombe. I'm the Associate Dean of Undergraduate and Graduate Education here in the College of Engineering and Technology. So that basically means that as the graduate students, as you guys progress through your graduate studies here in the college, your various forms of paperwork, things like that along the way, they're going to be routing through my office. And together, working together with the graduate program director, your advisors, will be the go-to people if you have questions about the thesis or dissertation process along the way. But for today, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Cathleen Rhodes is a master lecturer from the Department of Women's and Gender Studies in the College of Arts and Letters here at ODU. For many years now, she's played an integral role in establishing many of the rules and processes that graduate students need to follow in order to complete their degrees, especially as they relate to thesis and dissertations. Her many contributions include development of the actual ODU guide for preparation of theses and dissertations, which you will surely become very familiar with soon enough, in a matter of minutes, I believe. If you haven't already had a chance to look at that, this is an online document that you can refer to, or you need to refer to when you're actually preparing your document. There are also some additional resources that you can get from your GPDs and your advisors about the various schedules and timelines that you're going to need to follow. But for today, there is really no better person on campus for you to hear from about today's topic. So without further delay, I'll turn the show over to Professor Rhodes.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here. I dropped a link in the chat for you if you'd like to follow along with these slides on your own or refer back to them later, or you can scan the little QR code really quickly. But I have been doing this for a long time, since about 2007. I've been doing thesis and dissertation work for various colleges on campus, primarily for arts and letters and for the College of Engineering. And I would encourage you, as we go through the presentation, if you have questions, you can certainly ask me those at the end, but also I don't mind if we address those along the way. If you'd like to put them in the chat, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat. But also, if you have your camera on, it works really well if you wave me down or maybe raise your hand. So you can also unmute yourself. Don't feel like you have to wait for me to pause, because sometimes I don't take much time to pause. I just move right on through. So if you have a burning question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask that question as we go along. The fall workshop, there's a question in the chat about that workshop. This is the same one. So if you didn't make it in the fall, you get all of that right here today. So you don't need to worry about having not attended that one. It's the same stuff. All right, so let's move through this. I usually like to start by thinking about why this process exists. It can be frustrating, I know, to do a lot of work on a thesis or a dissertation, and then you get to the end and it's like, okay, so now you have to format this thing. But there are some really good reasons why the formatting process exists. And one of those is that we want to make sure that you're adhering to ODU guidelines. So the College of Engineering is actually really doing you a favor by making sure that your documents get checked for these issues before you submit to the registrar's office. So there are some universities where you're just kind of on your own. You submit to the registrar and then you cross your fingers and hope that they don't kick it back to you and say, oh, sorry, you can't graduate, but there are problems with your margins or other kinds of problems. So The registrar's office really is the last stop on this train, and they decide whether or not you've adhered to the guidelines that everybody who writes a thesis or dissertation at ODU has to adhere to. So we want to make sure that you don't get to that stop with problems. We want to head those problems off earlier. And the other reason for this process is that it aids in professionalism. And what I mean by that is that the process of formatting the thesis or dissertation ensures that it meets some professional expectations. And just as a journal has professional expectations, or if you publish a book later on, any of those publishers are going to have their own internal style guides and their own internal expectations of what you should do with your manuscript before it ever even gets to them. I'm just going to mute a couple of people here. There we go. Let's see. Yes, so this helps prepare you for that process. Sorry, I have two computers open. I keep clicking on the wrong one to make the slides move forward. So we'll talk about the process for the College of Engineering and Technology, and they've done a very nice job of setting out a series of steps for you to meet. So at least 2 weeks before the registrar's deadline, and the registrar's deadline is always available for you on the current academic calendar. So if you look at the ODU website and go to the academic calendar for the spring, for example, you can find the registrar's deadline. And it's a different deadline for a thesis submission and a dissertation submission. Generally, dissertations are due to the registrar earlier than theses are. But at least 2 weeks before that deadline, you have to do the following. So you and your advisor need to make sure that your thesis or your dissertation adheres to all the guidelines set out in the ODU guide for preparation of theses and dissertations. And that's what I'll keep calling that the ODU guide. The title's too long to repeat over and over, and we'll take a look at the ODU guide in just a couple of minutes. But you need to make sure that you're adhering to those guidelines. At least 1 week prior to that registrar's deadline, you need to submit to the Dean's Office Coordinator several things. One is the thesis and dissertation tracking form, and you fill out the top of that. You also need to submit to them an electronic Word copy of your manuscript. And then for master's students, you'll fill out the M3 form. For PhD students, you'll fill out the D5 form, and you need to have that signed by just your committee members. And I have for you samples of what those should look like. So the M3 is on the left side and the D5 is on the right-hand side. And you need to have filled out and had your committee members sign. So those are all the red circled areas on there. All of those need to be completed when you submit those materials. And then next, the Dean's Office Coordinator, now that you've submitted all those materials to the coordinator, that person assigns an editor to your thesis or your dissertation. And something that's really important to know, if you missed that previous step of submitting at least 1 week prior to the registrar's deadline, you then are responsible for obtaining your own editor and paying for that yourself. So you want to make sure that you get it in on time. This is a really nice service that's provided by the college, but you need to get it in a timely manner in order to take advantage of that. The Dean's Office Coordinator is going to return an electronic copy of the edited thesis or dissertation to you. So they assign you to an editor. An editor goes in, often using something like track changes, and indicates all of the changes that you need to make. And then you will get an electronic copy of that back from the Dean's Office Coordinator. And then after that, you're going to make those revisions and you submit a corrected PDF version of your document and the copy with the editor's notes on it to your advisor, who's going to review those documents. The advisor reviews your corrected version, the PDF that you've sent, and then forwards that, if everything looks good, forwards that to the GPD for another review and approval. And then after the final review by your advisor and by the GPD, the advisor is going to submit to the Dean's Office Coordinator. And what will be sent at that point is that corrected final PDF copy of your document, of your thesis or dissertation, the completed and signed certificate of completeness form to indicate that that process has been completed, and then the M3 and D5 form that I mentioned earlier, that will be submitted with the committee member signatures and the GPD signatures included. Let's see. Okay. After that, the Dean's Office Coordinator forwards all of those documents to the Dean or to the Associate Dean for review and for a signature. And then the Dean or the Associate Dean reviews your document, signs the M3 and the D5. That's way at the bottom is when the Dean or Associate Dean signs that. And then if any additional edits are required at that point, you have to make those edits and resubmit your corrected copy to the Dean's office for approval. So there's a really rigorous process of review to help ensure that you're meeting all the requirements as you go through the process. Then the Dean's Office Coordinator is going to contact you either with an email or a phone call to notify you that your M3 or D5 form, again, depending on whether you're a master's student or a PhD student, but to notify you that that form has been sent to the department, or to notify you that there are additional edits that you need to make. Once you get that notification from the coordinator that your document has been approved, that's when you can upload the approved version, that approved PDF, to ProQuest. And this is what people mean. Sometimes they refer to it as submitting to the registrar. That's what this is. When you upload to ProQuest, you are submitting to the registrar's office. So you should only do that once you have received that notification from the Dean's Office Coordinator that the document has been approved. And then the department designee is going to forward the M3 form or the D5 form to the registrar's office on your behalf. So that indicates to the registrar's office that you should indeed be uploading to ProQuest. So I know that was a lot to think about in the process, but you will get, or you probably already have gotten, a copy of this information. It usually gets sent out to students in the form of an email with a document that lists all those steps. But again, you also have access to this slideshow if later on you're not quite clear on what the steps are of the process. In terms of what the editors are looking for when we are assigned your document, there are a few things. Okay. Actually, let me pause for just a second and ask if we have any questions yet, because I've just been zooming right through this. Are we good?
I'm sorry, ma'am, I do have a question.
Sure.
With regards to hypotheticals, I'm looking at the calendar, and it's got a deadline right now, upcoming calendar dates, February 28th, thesis, dissertations due, session 2. Does that mean that, what is that date?
Okay, I'm glad you asked. Yes, it's a little confusing. There are many sessions now. It used to be in the olden days, right? It used to be there was one session per semester. And if you were looking at the spring semester, you could assume you were going to graduate in May. ODU now offers many sessions within a particular semester. So you're looking at probably session 1 for that deadline. Most people are going to graduate in the full 15-week session, which in the spring would be in May. So you want to look for the deadline that is for the full 15-week session.
Okay, so that would be, I believe on this calendar is May 26th. That doesn't seem like 2 weeks ahead, though.
Let me just take a look with you really quickly to see.
I'm just trying to follow because essentially what I'm gathering is that all the things that you said needs to happen happens in about a 2 week span. Is that correct?
It happens very quickly. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So if we're looking for the spring term, actually it is session 1 that is the full term. So this is the one that you want to look at if you're assuming that you're going to graduate in May. And then those deadlines for the registrar's office would be, are you submitting a, oh, it doesn't matter. They're both on the same day. May 3rd is the deadline for submission to the registrar's office.
Okay.
And like, if I could add, these are the deadlines. It does seem like everything's compressed into a 2 week period. That's sort of encouragement to get started earlier so that you don't literally have to do everything in a 2 week period.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. That makes sense. It just seemed like when I saw a deadline, I'm thinking, oh my gracious, that's a lot of stuff to have to happen in a 2 week time frame.
It is a short window, but and maybe that's instructive for everyone else listening here. To cram all of this into a 2 week window is difficult, which is why we recommend doing these things before the deadlines, not literally at the deadline.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
So the question is, so we have 2 weeks before, or suggested 2 weeks before the May 3rd deadline.
Yes, that's the very last time that's the latest that you should start that process.
Okay, and so we have the 2 week window to start the process from the beginning, sending the first draft, getting all the editing figured out, and then submitting the final copy.
Right. The only thing I wouldn't call it a first draft. That can be confusing to people. It is, for all intents and purposes, your final, what you assume to be the final version of your document. So, you've defended and everything, but it's maybe the first draft of the formatted part of the document.
Right, correct.
Okay.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning.
Yeah.
And to clarify, there are editorial reviews and things like that will occur within that 2 week period, and it's always fair game that the student will be asked to make revisions to things, even though you've submitted this earlier draft. So, just so as heads up is sort of what we're saying. And one final note: your dissertation or thesis committees will drive the schedule as well. They might expect you, and they will communicate to you that they might expect to see draft copies well before the deadlines that we're talking about here today. That will vary depending on your advisor and your entire dissertation committee.
I can also tell you to sort of follow up on that. As someone who's done this editing for a very long time, you're going to have edits. These documents are complicated. The ODU guide can be very specific in some places. You've worked on it over the course of many different months, sometimes a few different years. And so things are going to come up. You are going to want to make sure that you leave time to do some revision because you're going to have things that you need to revise. And we have a couple of questions in the chat. One is about why there aren't word templates. Dr. Lacombe, I think maybe you can address that one better than I can.
The why? No, I don't know that I can.
Okay.
But I can say that this is something that is currently being discussed and worked on directly with the graduate school. I don't think that anything will be prepared in time for this spring semester, but the hope is that we'll be able to try to put together some templates moving forward. Part of the challenge is that these documents vary in format and structure from college to college and even program to program across campus. But I'm a strong proponent of doing this, so I think we can probably give some guidance to future engineering grad students, maybe starting next year, depending on how quickly we can put together a template.
Thank you. And then someone has asked, what if the main chapters of the dissertation are already published? Will someone still have to reformat those? And the answer is yes, because they have to be formatted according to ODU's thesis and dissertation guidelines. They probably have been previously formatted according to the guidelines of whoever published that chapter before.
And maybe I can add in a little bit here. historically, ODU hasn't strictly prohibited the inclusion of published papers within a thesis or dissertation. But if you were trying to follow the handbook, it can be a little bit confusing how one goes about doing this. We're in the midst of changing the official rules to formally permit republishing of manuscripts that have been peer reviewed, appeared in journals, or maybe not just submitted, but to repurpose those as separate chapters or something like that within a thesis or dissertation. This is going to be permitted starting next year in a more open and obvious way for students. You won't really see mention of this within the current version of the handbook that's being discussed. But if you have questions about how to go through doing this, please contact me directly, and I can work with the GPD and your advisor to give some guidance on that. In other words, there are some policy changes underway that will make this a little bit easier. But exactly how they need to be reformatted is still to be determined.
All right, those are great questions. If we think about what the editors are going to be looking for as we check your documents, there are a few things. One is that we're making sure that you adhere to the ODU guide. So in other words, if it says do it, we make sure you do it. If it says don't do it, we make sure you don't do it. Some examples of that, and there are many more than what I have here, but some examples are the ODU guide says you must have 1-inch margins at the top, bottom, left, and right. So we're ensuring that your margins are 1 inch. Sometimes the ODU guide is specific about spacing, or it says you can determine the spacing, but it must be at least 2 double spaces. So we're making sure that if there are spacing guidelines in the ODU guide and there are font guidelines, we're making sure that you adhere to those guidelines. And then a big thing that we check for in terms of formatting is what I call the preliminary pages. And those are things like the title page, the abstract page, the table of contents, the list of tables, everything before page 1 of the actual thesis or dissertation. The ODU guide is very specific about how it wants those formatted, what the spacing should look like, what should be in all caps versus not all caps, and so on. So we're looking for all of those kinds of issues. The other thing that we are checking for is for consistency and accuracy. So a minute ago, I gave you the example. The ODU guide tells you you must have at least 2 double spaces before and after all tables and figures. So if you used 3 double spaces in chapter 1 before your tables and after your tables and figures, then we are looking in chapters 2 through 5 to make sure that you have also used the same number of double spaces. So making sure that you are consistent throughout the document. And this begins to be an issue sometimes because, like I said before, you work on different chapters at different time periods and you sort of forget what you did in chapter 1 by the time you get to chapter 5. So we're looking for that consistency. And then we are also checking grammar and mechanics. So we're reading through every word of the document to look for punctuation issues, spelling mistakes, because sometimes there are some spelling mistakes that don't get caught by spell check. We're looking for grammar issues. And the assumption is before the document comes to us that you will have already edited extensively. So you certainly don't want to think to yourself, oh, well, this will eventually go to an editor who's going to check grammar and mechanics anyway. So I'm just going to let everything go. Because as we've already said, you have this compressed time period to make all the revisions at the end. So you want to make sure you've done your due diligence earlier. But of course, some errors slip through, and that's what we are looking for. So I've been talking a lot about the ODU guide. I wanted to take a look at it for a minute, but this is the guide that all students at ODU complete if they are writing a thesis or dissertation. It doesn't matter what college they're in, every thesis, every dissertation that comes through ODU has to meet these requirements. And so it has to look similar from one thesis or dissertation to another. So I'm just going to quickly show you what that guide looks like. you'll notice, let's see, how long is the guide? It's something like, 55 pages long. But don't worry about that. It's not as bad as it sounds, because more than half of the guide is actually sample pages. But you'll notice if we look at this table of contents, it's giving you lots of things to think about. So no matter where you are in the process, if you have not even started to write your thesis or dissertation, if you're planning to graduate in May, this document applies to both situations and everybody in between. It's a really good idea to take a look at this early on to figure out, okay, so what do I need to be thinking about in the various parts of the thesis or dissertation writing process? Editing, though, the kind of work that I do on these documents, a lot of that work is going to show up in this manuscript details section. So this is when it tells you all the things about how big or small can your font be? What should your margins be? What should the spacing be above and below your headings and subheadings? And then the other, I'm just going to scroll down for us to these sample pages. But halfway through the document, we'll get to the sample pages. And then what you get here is a sample page that has all of this information in red. And these are comments. This is all information that's found earlier in the ODU guide, but it's here to make it simpler for you to follow along as you create your own preliminary pages. So in this case, this is the title page. This is the very first page for everybody who writes a thesis or dissertation. And so you're going to want to make sure that it looks like this, and also that you're paying attention to all these little comments over here. So you'll notice your title has to be centered. It has to be in all caps. It has to be double spaced if it's more than one line long, and so on. This statement, a dissertation submitted, blah, 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 has to be broken exactly after this of, after this the, and the title case has to follow what we have here. Title case is when you capitalize the first letter of every major word. And so I'm just trying to make sure that you understand that you're creating a document that looks exactly like what you see here. If you go to the next page in the ODU guide, what you'll notice is that each of the sample pages has a clean version of it without all the comments. So I would recommend that you use this when you first create the document, like when you first create the title page. And then after you feel like you've got your title page fixed, pull up both of these documents side by side on your computer. So one is this clean version of the title page, and then the other is your title page, and just visually compare the two of them. But when we edit, we're going through to make sure that your title page looks exactly like this. And you'll notice there is a sample page for every single preliminary page. Some of these preliminary pages are required. Some of them are not required. You can include them if you want to. So for example, the copyright page, you can include a copyright page if you'd like to, but it's not required to do that. I'm just going to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. Zach, can you clarify your question in the chat for me about LaTeX? I'm not sure what you mean by a final other than Word. Oh, do you mean a final version that is submitted to the Dean's Office Coordinator? And while I wait for that, I'm just going to move through some more of these sample pages. But like I said, so you'll see each of the sample pages in this. If you get to this guide is being revised. I'm not sure when that revision is going to come out, but there are a few of the pages that the text, the explanatory text, gets cut off. Don't be concerned or alarmed by that. This information does appear earlier in the document. It's just here for convenience in the second part. And then if I scroll down a little bit, you'll see that there are also samples for the tables of contents, and you get 3 different options for that. One is this Roman numerals option. The one that most people in the College of Engineering use, I think, is this one with Arabic numerals. And this is particularly useful if you're going to have a lot of subheadings, because the subheadings get numbered. So you could have chapter 1, and then under that, of course, you see here they have 1.1, but maybe even under theoretical formulations, they have a 1.1.1, a 1.1.2. Okay, so I see that Zach is asking about the final format of the document. There are some people who use something like LaTeX. In that case, you would need to submit it as a PDF document when you send it to the Dean's Office coordinator. A Word version is kind of ideal for us. It's just much easier to use track changes, and you can make the edits much faster using that. But of course, if you're not using something that you can submit as a Word document, then a PDF. All right, so that's the ODU guide, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that, but I really just wanted to give you an overview of what that guide looks like. Give me a second to get back to my slideshow here. Now, as we edit, I thought it would be helpful to you to have a list of some of the common mistakes that we see. We often see mistakes in words that are in all caps, and there are lots of times in the ODU guide when it says you must have this in all caps, like the title on the title page, the title on the abstract page, that even the headings like abstract or table of contents, those must be in all caps. If you're using, I don't know how this works in LaTeX, but if you're using Microsoft Word, sometimes it will check the spelling of words in all caps, and sometimes you have to go in and fiddle with that setting in Microsoft Word, because it won't catch spelling mistakes initially, and you have to turn it off and turn it back on. I don't know why jiggling with it like that works, but that's what I have found in the past. We're also making sure that your bibliography is correctly alphabetized, or whatever categorization scheme that you've used in that matches throughout. And this seems pretty obvious. You're like, well, alphabetizing, I've been doing that for a long time. But what I always tell people is that you've worked on your thesis or dissertation for a long time. And sometimes you start to not be able to see things. So it can be a case where you thought you had everything alphabetized, but you added somebody a citation in many months after you had done other work, and they're in there incorrectly. I heard something. Did someone have a question? Okay. And we've got a vote for the 1.1.1 in the chat. So yeah, it is very convenient. Other things that we check: the table of contents, the list of figures, the list of tables, those must match the body of the document exactly. So what I mean by that is whatever the title is for chapter 1 or table 1 or figure 6, when we get to that part in the document, that title must match it exactly in terms of like what it actually says, in terms of the capitalization that you use. So we're checking that those match. And this is just an example of the list of tables and list of figures. So for example, when I get to, what page is that on? Page 38, when I see figure 4, it should read exterior of the Chinese Confucius School located at 949 Waterman Avenue. You cannot, for example, have exterior of the Chinese Confucius School when we get to page 38. They have to match. Other things we look for are sometimes you will need to change from portrait to landscape. So if you have a very wide table, for example, or a figure that you need to change the orientation of the document, you have to keep that page number in the same place and orientation as it would have been if it were portrait. And this can be confusing. So what I mean by this is, if you flip through a printed book from the library and all the page numbers are always going to be in the same spot in that printed book. In our case, for the ODU guide, they're in the upper right-hand corner. If there's a part in the book where they have a very wide table, and so you need to turn the book sideways, the page number doesn't change. It still looks like the page number on all the other pages. So that's a common thing that we see that people mess up on. And here's an example of that. So you'll see you'd have to turn the document sideways to read this table, but the page number is going to show up just like it would in the upper right-hand corner of the page in portrait mode. Other things, often people space inconsistently above or below their tables or figures. So that's what I mentioned before. The ODU guide says it must be at least 2 double spaces. And if you use 3 double spaces or something crazy, and by the way, I would recommend that you not do crazy things, that you make this as simple for yourself as you possibly can. So don't try to get too fancy with it. The idea here is 1, to graduate, to finish this, and then 2, to have it out in the world in a way that looks professional. But the fancier you try to get with it, it's just the more opportunities for things not to match from one part of the document to the other. So if you're using double spacing in the rest of the document, keep the spacing above and below your tables and figures in double spaces. Just use the 2 double spaces rather than, some people will use like a double space and a single space, but it'll make your life a little bit more miserable than it needs to be than if you just stuck with the double spacing. Also, I wanted to bring us to, let's see. Okay, yeah, sorry, I wanted you to see this first. This idea that if you use images or tables or figures from other sources, you must ensure that you don't have to get copyright permission. So some people think, for example, oh, I'm going to use this map from this other book or a government document or something, and I'll cite it underneath the map that this is where I got it from. But citations are not always adequate. If you're using something like that map, what you need to do is go back to its original source and figure out whether you need to request copyright permission. So if it's in a book, you very well might need to request copyright permission to reprint this image or this this map or this whatever it is that a person has created as a part of that book. Government documents sometimes will say, you know, you can use this freely, attribute to us, but you don't have to request copyright permission and so on. This, I think, is probably particularly important to think about right now. Just if you think about all the issues that have arisen for several high-profile academics in terms of things like plagiarism, but also you want to make sure, and these are cases where they've gone back to people's dissertations from 2 decades ago to check them. You want to make sure if you're using these primarily visual materials from outside sources, that you're making sure that either you get copyright permission or you're ensuring that you don't need to get that copyright permission. And I know there are sometimes questions about those, so let me know if you have questions about that. And there's a question about tables and figure sizes. Are there standard ones that need to be followed? That sometimes is a question for that is answered within the discipline, but I can say in terms of the ODU guide, the guidelines are that it fit within the 1-inch margins and that you be consistent in the sizes. There's also a section in the guide about, let me see if I can find it really quickly. I think it's going to be in the font size section, which is on page 8. So it tells you that 10-point minimum, 12-point maximum for the body of the thesis or dissertations. And an exception to that is tables, figures, and appendix material can vary. And then it tells you The maximum is, sorry, hang on. Point size reduction can be made in footnotes, tables, figures, and appendix material, and they give you a minimum of 1.5 millimeters. I don't know how helpful that is. It's more helpful in some kinds of word processing software than others. Typically, that means you don't want to go any smaller than like 9-point font for that. But hopefully that answered your question about tables and figures. Any other questions before we move on?
Yes, I have a quick question. What about tables that might span multiple pages?
Oh, that's a good one. Yes. Actually, we can go right back to that guide. Somewhere in here, let's see. There's a section about oversized tables. Page 6. Sorry for this scrolling. Yes. If they are longer than a page, you have to include the complete title and number only on the first page. And so every other page, excuse me, every other page after that is going to have the table or figure number and then just the word continued. So you won't have the title on there. This is really important though. You have to repeat the column headings. So if you have a table, and it spans 2 pages, on the second page, you need to repeat those column headings so that your reader can easily read that second part of the table.
Okay, thank you.
And then the last thing that I have here under common mistakes is misusing citation generators. And that's this link that I had here for you. This is a very useful link from Purdue OWL about how to use citation generators responsibly. And I'm just going to click off of this little guy in the video, I think is distracting. But you get from a citation generator only as good as what you put in. So what I mean by that is you want to be very careful when you are inputting the information into the citation generator, that you are correctly, you put the full name of the author, or you make sure that you get the title exactly right. Otherwise, it's going to give back to you messy material. And you definitely don't want to be having to redo your bibliography in those last 2 weeks before you submit to the registrar's office. You want to have worked on that earlier. Even though that's a hard thing sometimes to make yourself be disciplined enough to worry about the bibliography. You really want to work on the research and like developing your argument, but it's important that you carve aside some time in that process to do that, because it can be a real pain if you have a lot of those to fix at the end. So we can open this up now for other questions. Anything that I haven't covered or that you didn't quite understand, we can look at the ODU guide again if you'd like to do that.
Do you have any helpful tips on how to avoid plagiarism? A lot in the news, as you said. I'm sure a lot of it's unintentional. Any good tips on how to avoid that?
I would say, first of all, Purdue OWL is an excellent resource in a lot of ways. And I know that they cover this. So you can just Google Purdue OWL plagiarism, and they'll give you probably many more useful tips than I can think of. I would say, and I teach in women's and gender studies now, but I used to teach in the Department of English and I taught writing. And you want to be very careful with your note taking. So before you ever even get to the point where you're doing something with the material, be very careful in your notes, whether you take notes by hand or you keep them in an electronic document, whatever it is, that you are very specifically indicating to yourself when those words or those ideas belong to someone else. Because it can be so easy 3 months later to come back and look at your notes and think, oh, I must have been thinking that. I must have come up with that idea because there are no quotation marks around it and I didn't put anyone's name. So very careful note taking. And I think, Dr. Lacombe, it looks like you have some suggestions. Yeah.
Yeah. There are a variety of different tools, software tools available, like Turnitin, Grammarly, things like that, that do a pretty good job of helping to try to make sure that you're avoiding plagiarism through various mechanisms. I would recommend using one of those to assist you. But one thing I do want to add a little bit more on, and this is a major misconception among students and frankly some of the faculty in the sciences, engineering and sciences, is that we have an unfortunate tendency to self-plagiarize. This is a form of plagiarism where you are essentially reusing your own stuff, right? If you write a paper that's published out there in literature, you don't really have rights to that in 99% of the time. The copyright is owned by the publisher, not by the author. So you have to make sure that you not only deal with the plagiarism aspects and cite yourself, but you have to make sure that you get permissions as well. Permissions and plagiarism are related, but separate issues. Suffice it to say that when you reuse, maybe you had a very, very good experimental background section that you wrote in a paper that you published last year, simply copying and pasting and reusing it in your dissertation, that by itself requires additional steps. You need to get permission from the publisher to reuse the material, and you absolutely are going to have to cite it as you go forward. One great way to catch all of these things are these software tools that I mentioned, like Grammarly or Turnitin, and there are others.
Hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Let's see here in the chat. Steps and formats for writing the proposal. That's before it gets to us. I don't know if Dr. Lacombe, if you have specific advice for that in terms of in the college.
We don't have any specific guideline or rules within the college, and there definitely isn't a campus-wide. For this, you should be talking to your advisor and to your dissertation or thesis committee members. They will lay out the expectations for this. That said, there are conversations to try to standardize this a little bit more than we currently do on campus. But out of necessity, there's still going to be a lot of latitude given to the different disciplines. There's just different approaches that we use for these things.
I have a question that goes back to the tables. So when we have the tables that span multiple pages, do we, for example, still fall under the rule of the exception of table font size, or do we have to standardize it within the same size of the body as explained by the guide?
Yeah, whether your table fits on one page or spans 3 pages, it still applies that you can reduce that font size as long as you stay within the parameters that they mention in the ODU guide.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have one more question
Sure.
that relates to citation. So I've noticed multiple times when I'm doing a literature review, there are some papers that are published through multiple different publishers, and so they might have different DOIs where you can refer to them. And I've noticed that some programs can give you the option to actually request all the author information through these numbers, through whether it was a book, different ISBN numbers depending on the version of the book, whether a hard book, hardcover, or a soft cover, or for example, if it was published in IEEE or published in Nature, or so on. Now, when I try to get the information, sometimes it is formatted differently. There are information that is different between one publisher to the other, maybe like a middle name or maybe a first name that is a little different and so on. So usually what do we do in that case? Which one do we grab the information from?
Yeah, so you're saying that the paper itself is the same. It's just published in different places with different publishers. Is that right?
Correct, yes.
Okay. I would use the one that you actually referred to. So this is kind of like it's not exactly the same, but if you had a book that had several editions and you were using the first edition or you were using the third edition, you would use all the information that was associated with that particular edition. So one example of this is that the publication date is going to be different from the first and third editions. So in your case, whichever version it was that you used, I would use only the citation information from that particular publisher. Does that answer that? Is that getting at what you're asking?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have a question. You mentioned the deadlines and the process there, which was very helpful. But is there any insight into how long this process takes from the time you first get your dissertation submitted to the end? How long does it take on average?
You mean just the formatting part of this?
The entire review. Like, I mean, you know, the 2 weeks, if you wait to the drop dead deadline, you know, and you take the 2 weeks, you know, it's painful, but it's done. But on how long does it actually take most students on average, you know, to complete the process?
I can maybe give a little bit of insight in the College of Engineering. I could say it varies quite a bit depending on exactly what kinds of editorial comments you're getting in some of these review steps. But that said, we have been able to, it has been possible to process it from the time somebody defends to the time somebody uploads it to ProQuest and, you know, wipes their hands of it and they're done. That can be done theoretically in about a week's time, but that requires a lot of people to drop everything else that they're doing. These are like, you know, GPDs, they're deans. I mean, there's a lot of very busy people to all stand in line to wait for these things to come to them. And we do this. We usually try to help students who are in usually extenuating circumstances who are asking us to do this. But I don't want to overemphasize that it is possible to do this because it's making a lot of people's lives on the back end miserable in addition to the student. So what I'd say is try to get it done, you know, at least at no later than 2 weeks beforehand. Ideally, it's before that. But we have, like I said, been able to rush things through when we more or less have a lot of people drop everything that they're doing in order to accommodate it.
There's a question in the chat about citation formats and whether they're in the ODU guide. They are not, and that's because there are too many possibilities. That guide is used by all colleges. What you want to do is talk with your committee, your thesis or dissertation committee, to see what format you should be using for citations in your document. And I think, Teresa, maybe you had a question.
I was just going to add that I think my advisor has suggested to me, and I think this is actually very sage advice, that be prepared to spend a semester following up after you defend your dissertation, following up on all the admin stuff to get through. Now, I mean, that means defending your dissertation at the beginning of that semester, but if you don't want to cause a lot of pain for people, and there are professors that maybe are not in this country, be prepared to actually spend one last semester getting it all done.
Let's see.
We have about 2 minutes before our speaker has to go teach, I believe.
Yes. So there's a question in the chat about when you use text from your own journal manuscript. If we receive copyright permission for an existing manuscript to reuse text, how do we provide this to ODU? Let me answer that question first. There are two ways to do this, whether the copyright permission is for something that you wrote or if it's from someone else. You can include in your acknowledgement section a little acknowledgement that says something like, thank you to the Museum of such and such for use of this image and this image. A better way to do this, I think, is to include as an appendix to your document a screenshot. So like a lot of this happens in email. You might email a publisher to say, can I reprint this thing that I wrote, or can I reprint this image from this journal article? And they will often reply and say, yes, if you do X, Y, and Z, or whatever. But if you get permission through an email, you can include a screenshot of that email as an appendix. Or if there is a section of their website that explicitly lays out copyright permission information, you can include a screenshot of that. And the reason that I always suggest that you do it this way is because then it lives with the document. So if at any point anybody has any questions about whether you should have used your own chapter 2 that had been published somewhere else before, they can refer to Appendix A and see that you had permission to do that. The second part of that question was, for manuscripts not yet submitted, do we notify the journal upon submission that portions of the text will be published in the dissertation? I would say yes, that's a good idea. It's going to depend. It's going to vary from one publisher to the other. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I second that though.
Yeah.
Communication with publishers, full disclosure for everybody is really the best policy.
Yeah. And then using a case study methodology with peer review of the case study, where do the peer reviews go into the dissertation? I'm not sure.
That would probably depend on the details of how and what you're presenting in the document. Check with your advisor and your committee to see what they'd like to see.
Yeah, so we're at 125. I'd say certainly if you have follow-up questions, your committee is always the first good place to go with those. Thank you for your questions today and for being here. I think, how will they get a copy of the Zoom link? Some people had asked me about that.
Yes, I put a few comments in the chat, but for those who are still here, the recording of this is going to be made available through the Baton College of Engineering website. If you go, there's a link for current students, click on that. Then there'll be a link for graduate, click on that. And underneath that is a whole bunch of resources, information, forms. I just looked, in the deadlines are actually for December. So we have to update those deadlines for this semester. But generally speaking, all of this kind of information will be available there. It's a great place to use as just a general resource for finishing your thesis and dissertation and all those things. So recording will be there.
Okay. Good luck, everybody. Have fun with your thesis.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.